Resident Evil has created so many iconic moments throughout the series. Starting with the original game, a lot of us grew up with the survival horror franchise, and because of that, we're left with so many incredible memories. However, one thing that's a little harder to forget than most are the first introductions that we have with the monsters of Resident Evil. From the traditional zombie in the original game all the way to the werewolves in the latest numbered entry of the series, the franchise has always created some of the most memorable first encounters with each of these creatures. So on today's list, I'm taking a look back at some of the most iconic and memorable first encounters with the monsters of Resident Evil. There is one rule for today's video before we get started. At least for this list, I'm not including any stalker enemies or boss encounters. That will probably be saved for a different list, so stay tuned for that. Instead, we're looking at the regular enemies of each game. And as always, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best monster introductions to Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Bandersnatch, Code Veronica. We start off today's list with a monster straight from one of the hardest entries of the series, Code Veronica. As the last traditional style Resident Evil game, Code Veronica proved to be one of the most difficult. Whether it's the extremely difficult boss fights, the very limited resources, or the new enemy types, Code Veronica proves to be one of the more challenging classic survival horror games out there. One creature that adds to that difficulty is the abomination version of the traditional tyrant, the Bandersnatch. Your first introduction to this creature is after Alfred, current head of the Ashford family, catches Claire in a trap in which he sets this beast loose on her. Between the disturbing monster design of the Bandersnatch, its creepy, heavy breathing, and the terrifying soundtrack that plays as it stares Claire down, our first encounter with a Bandersnatch is one that we'll never forget. Number 9, Deimos, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Yeah, not all of our first encounters with the creatures of the franchise are scary. Some of them are just plain weird. Take the bug-like creatures from Resident Evil 3 for example, the Deimos. While extremely annoying and frustrating to deal with, especially when you're trying to complete that no healing trophy playthrough, our first encounter with this oversized bug is disturbing to say the least. As Jill makes her way over to the power station, one of these creatures slowly crawls towards her. Then, out of nowhere, it sticks one of its legs into her mouth and forces parasites down her throat. Essentially, this parasite will eat away at Jill's health until she uses a green herb, which is exactly why you don't want to get caught a second time by one of these creatures if you're trying to go for that one herb only trophy. Still, while not exactly the scariest intro, this one is definitely memorable and probably one of the weirdest first encounters of the franchise. Number 8, Mimicry Marcus, Resident Evil 0.
Excuse me, sir. Sir.
One of my favorite themes of RE0 is the track that plays when you come across a leech zombie, aka Mimicry Marcus. These guys are basically one of the most dangerous regular enemies of the game and are extremely frustrating to deal with. Funny enough though, you actually come across your first one early on in the game. While on the train at the start of the game, Rebecca will come across one of these creatures. However, unlike the rest of the ones that you'll face throughout the game, your first encounter isn't nearly as difficult as it doesn't fully transform until Billy shows up in the cutscene and saves Rebecca. Still, we get a pretty badass money shot from Billy as he pulls off a Mission Impossible stunt and takes out a bunch of leeches. If only all of these creatures were this easy to take down. Number 7, Majini, Resident Evil 5.
Freeze! Are you okay?
Regeneradors and RE4 set the tone for what to expect in the sequels to come, including Resident Evil 5. Just like its predecessor, RE5 traded out zombies for humans infected with a parasite, allowing them to still be able to communicate with each other and use weapons. In Resident Evil 5, these reoccurring enemies would be known as the Majini. While the first Ganado gave Leon a pretty badass moment, the first Majini completely outshines it with a pretty gruesome and terrifying introduction. After breaking into a building, Chris and Sheva arrive just in time to find a villager being force-fed some sort of parasite. After chasing the attackers away, we see a full disturbing transition from an innocent villager to a Majini right before our very eyes. The moment of this innocent man's eyes slowly becoming bloodshot as the parasite takes hold of him is easily one of the more memorable introductions to an enemy in Resident Evil. Number 6. Cerberus, Resident Evil. Fun fact, the first official monster that we ever see in the Resident Evil franchise is not a zombie. Technically, it's a Cerberus. Prior to any gameplay, the introduction of both versions of Resident Evil follows STAR's Alpha team as they arrive in the Arklay Mountains in search of Bravo team. Unfortunately, not long after arriving, zombie dogs attack and kill Joseph. The remaining survivors make a run for the Spencer Mansion as they are chased by a pack of zombie dogs known as Cerberus. Whether you prefer the original's cheesy live-action intro or the remake's in-engine cutscene, the introduction of the Cerberus dogs makes it very clear that leaving the Spencer Mansion via the front doors is not an option. And even if you don't want to count that as the first encounter since it's before the game even begins, then your first fight against one is just as iconic as it'll leave you scared as hell thanks to one of the best jump scares of the franchise. Number 5, Lycan, Resident Evil Village.
Jesus Christ. What the hell is wrong with this place?
So I give Village a lot of shit about how I don't find it as scary as Biohazard. I feel like the franchise took a step in the wrong direction as it once again leaned more heavily on the action horror over survival horror. Fortunately, there were a few moments in this game that still provided some terrifying moments. Obviously, the giant fetus is the first to come to mind, but honestly I would consider that creature more of a boss or a stalker enemy, so for today's video I couldn't include it. However, Ethan's introduction to the Lycan is just as terrifying in my opinion. After finding himself inside a small house with an old man, Lycans begin to attack from every direction, one of which grabs the old man and pulls him through the ceiling. Immediately after that, a second Lycan pulls Ethan through the floor. Here we find Ethan searching around in the dark as he sees a Lycan feeding on a corpse. Moments later, one of the best jump scares occurs when a Lycan attacks Ethan and bites a chunk out of his hand. Number 4, Regenerador, Resident Evil 4. Majini might have the Ganado beat, but the Regenerator in Resident Evil 4 by far has the best monster introduction out of the entire action horror trilogy. After finding himself in a dark lab, Leon eventually finds himself face to face with a Regenerator. Before we even see the face of this creature, it's already made a massive impact on the player. That's because of the sound that these monsters make. As Leon is making his way towards the exit, the Regenerator begins making its terrifying breathing sounds as it slowly approaches the door. Then, as the door opens, we come face to face with a creature that can heal itself over and over again unless we destroy the parasites hidden deep inside of its body. The face, the sounds it makes, and the design of the creature itself makes for one hell of an introduction. Number 3, The Hunter, Resident Evil. Another entry from the original game, and potentially not the last, the Hunter makes a dramatic first encounter in the original Nightmare. After entering the mansion once again, a cutscene will play out from the perspective of some sort of creature as it retraces Chris and Jill's steps back to the mansion. Considering that we see it leaping, making terrifying noises, and then opening a door with a reptile-like hand, we already know that what we're about to face is not human. Then after the cutscene ends, we're immediately forced to take on a leaping hunter. This introduction is straight out of a horror movie, and honestly, it reminded me a lot of the Evil Dead movies. I remember sweating like crazy as this mysterious creature grew closer and closer to my position. This scene was so iconic that it was recreated for the remake and even used in the Resident Evil 3 remake as well when Carlos is exploring the hospital. Number 2, Liquor, Resident Evil 2. Not gonna lie, I battled with myself about these top 2 entries, and honestly, they are both pretty much interchangeable. Ultimately, it just comes down to the preference. And overall, I just found the Liquor's introduction to be slightly less iconic. Still, let's face it, the Liquor's introduction is easily one of the most iconic and terrifying moments of the Resident Evil franchise. Hell, I would argue that it's one of the most terrifying moments in video game history. As Leon or Claire are working their way through the RPD station, they'll eventually come across a hall window where a pink creature will crawl across it quickly. Then after entering the hallway nearby, we notice a pool of blood and blood dripping from the ceiling. Already, these 2 small moments set the tone for what was coming next. Eventually, as we approach the pool of blood, we come face to face with a disturbing creature known as the Liquor. Its tongue sticks out as if it's tasting the air around you. Its skinless design is terrifying to look at, and the sound it makes as it recognizes that you're nearby is truly the stuff of nightmares. Ultimately, the Liquor will forever live in our minds, mainly because of this single iconic introduction to the creature. Number 1, Zombie, Resident Evil. Come on, like, really? Could I honestly look myself in the mirror if I didn't put our first encounter with a zombie in the Resident Evil franchise as number 1? Let's face it, zombies are a staple of the franchise. Sure, newer entries of the series moved away from these iconic monsters, but the fact remains that the franchise was built on these creatures and they were featured in the most classic Resident Evil games. But just like the Liquor, the scene of approaching a zombie for the very first time in Resident Evil is just unforgettable. Moving down the hallway as we hear a crunching sound. Then finding our fellow teammate on the ground dead, followed by a zombie feeding on his corpse. It doesn't stop there though. The money shot is of course when the zombie realizes that we're behind them and then slowly turns its head around to face us. with a bloody mouth and hungry for more flesh. This moment still sends chills up my spine, and I can't think of a more iconic introduction to a monster than this. And I don't mean just in Resident Evil, I mean all horror games. Hell, in all horror media, movies, TV, video games, nothing compares to my first encounter with a zombie in the Spencer Mansion, and the feeling that I had in that moment is completely indescribable. So for all of those reasons, our first encounter with a zombie in Resident Evil claims the #1 spot on today's list. But that does it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the zombie the best monster introduction of the franchise, or is there another creature that deserves that title? Also, would you guys like to see another video similar to this where I do the same thing but with the boss enemies and stalker enemies of the franchise? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.